Hello, and welcome to the Healing with Charlie podcast, where we chat about all things attachment styles and healing. I'm your host, Charlie, and today we're chatting with my great friend, Allie K. Campbell. Allie is a New Jersey-based content creator who creates educational content about life with fearful avoidant attachment and ADHD. I've been connected with Allie on TikTok for a while, and her videos are both hilarious and insightful. So today we're going to learn about her experience along with tips on how to manage dating when you have ADHD and disorganized attachment. Allie, thank you for joining the show today. Please kick things off by sharing a little bit about yourself.
Hi. First, thank you so much for having me. My name is Allie K. Campbell. As you said, I am a content creator that focuses on, well, first of all, I use the word focus very lightly, but on, having ADHD, navigating the dating scene with insecure attachment style, specifically fearful avoidant for myself, being a queer person in the dating scene, and all the kind of complexities that go along with the intersection of those things. And when I'm not doing that, I work in PR part-time. So just kind of helping brands narrate their stories in a way that won't get them closed down or canceled.
That's awesome. And I guess for your work that comes in pretty useful because social media and, sometimes being authentic, you run the risk of being canceled. And so it's a good skill set to have. Although I haven't seen anything too controversial by you, it's been interesting to see your content over the last year and a half that we've been connected, because there's a lot of it that I resonate with as someone who has also healed their fearful avoidant or disorganized attachment. There's some similar experiences I think we've shared because you've been pretty transparent about your life in dating and what that's been like. And that's kind of what attracted me to your content initially, because I was like, wow, this is another real person that's not sugarcoating what life is like. And that's kind of what I want to dive into first, kind of like your personal experience with ADHD. Like, how did you first discover you had ADHD? What was that process like?
So when I was a very young kid in the 90s, I remember I was struggling in school, I was struggling at home, and one of my teachers, I guess, said to my mom, Allie is behaving in ABC ways. And my mom kind of mirrored that and said, she's kind of struggling at home with a lot of stuff too, and even socially with friends and things like that. And said, do you think that we should get her tested for ADHD? And now my teacher at the time, was extremely against this. She just said, Allie is just flighty. Meanwhile, she was the one who initially talked to my mother about the fact that I was struggling, but that's besides the point. She said, I don't think that you should get her tested, because if you do, then she might end up in special needs classes. And she almost made that seem like it could be the worst possible situation for me, which if I ever met her face to face, first of all, it's on site. And second of all, it's actually the worst possible situation is me not getting help, which is what happened because, my mom, she was a very young mother. She had me when she was 19. She was basically still a kid herself and took this teacher's recommendation to not, look into it more at that point. So I struggled with ADHD from then on, and it wasn't until I was in my early 20s, after going to way too many psychiatrists that I even want to admit publicly, and getting misdiagnosed with bipolar and generalized anxiety disorder and depression and all that, that I finally found a doctor who was willing to listen to me and hear my life story, hear the way that my challenges show up in a daily way. And she just kind of said, you don't have any of those things. You have really bad ADHD. And I was like, that makes sense. That makes a lot of sense. Um, so yeah, I guess it was truly discovered when I was like a kid, but we didn't follow up, or I didn't follow up to get that full diagnosis and treatment for that matter until I was probably like 20, 19 or 20.
Hmm.
I'm 34 now. So
That's interesting. Yeah, I've heard a similar situation for a lot of people who go through that at a really early age as well. Like there's often misdiagnoses. There's also
mhm.
in the process of getting diagnosed, they feel alienated from the actual psychologist or whoever's doing
Mhm.
the diagnosis because it's almost as if they're not really having a conversation with you. They're
Yeah.
really just trying to figure out what's going on underneath the hood, for lack of a better way of putting it, right?
Yep.
And that creates a really negative situation for a lot of people, right? A really negative
Yeah.
impression and almost turns them off from wanting to pursue, management and living life in a different way altogether, which it seems like
Yeah.
that's what happened in your case. So I'm kind of curious, like, after you made this discovery and you had some clarity about your diagnosis, did life change at all for you? Did it become harder knowing that you now had this thing, but you still felt in the same spot?
I think there were some good things about it and there were some not so good things about it. I would say generally it was a net positive to get my diagnosis, because I was then able to get like proper treatment and put on medication and just have a better awareness of myself from this like huge missing piece.
Right.
Um, but life got a lot easier in the sense that like when you think about executive functioning,
Mm-hmm.
things like properly prioritizing, organizing, just emotional management and the basics of life and any facet of life. Like if you go from essentially not being able to do any of those things to all of a sudden being able to do those things, like obviously that's going to be a major transformation in your life. So in
Right.
that way, it totally turned everything around for me. I mean, I was finally able to graduate college after getting kicked out of one school prior and failing out of two prior. I got my bachelor's and my master's degree once I got into treatment for ADHD. I was able to hold down a job, which is like insane.
Yeah.
And there was definitely a ripple effect with like my relationships too. They seem to improve, but I definitely think there's a lot more going on in that part than just ADHD. So, they didn't just, improve completely overnight, more like the other things did, but they're all still, a struggle in some ways. And I would say like the bad or like negative part of it was like dealing with the resentment of like knowing I could have gotten help sooner.
Right.
Like had, that teacher done some research. And back then it was like, back then that sounds so dramatic, but like back then it was like, they didn't think anybody had ADHD except little boys. And we're still fighting against that
Yeah.
stigma. So like it was even less likely then for somebody to take the possibility that a little girl had ADHD seriously. But that pisses me off, like I wonder a lot, like how different might my life have been and how much pain may I have like avoided had I gotten the help that I needed at an earlier age, like had somebody done some kind of earlier intervention, and also just like grappling with the fact that I'm differently abled than most of the world, like we live in a capitalist society that doesn't exactly respond kindly to differently abled people. I've had to, cater my life to my ADHD because the world certainly doesn't cater to it. So
Yeah.
it's been a little bit of both.
Yeah. Well, that's great to hear. And I think you really touched on an interesting topic there, kind of like the intersection of gender and capitalism, right? Because you are right that, back in the day, at least for us, there were a lot more young boys getting diagnosed with ADHD, and they were getting treatment sooner. Even with other things like autism, women
Mm,
in particular were really flying under the radar. And that's only been in
absolutely.
for the last decade where, like, people are like, wait a minute, there might be something to this here. And I think there is something about that in relation to capitalism where, traditionally men were the workers, men were the breadwinners. And so
That's a good point.
in one way of like, of course they might get attention sooner, they might get diagnoses and help much sooner, but it almost leaves you feeling like how your life would be different, right, if that was just
Hmm.
not the case at the time. And I hear about that all the time from a lot of people who learn about attachment styles. They're like, how would my life
Mm,
have been different, how my relationship would have been different if I had just known about this months ago, right? And so it's a
yeah.
really similar theme within that space. And so I'm curious, now that you kind of have that whole experience and that wisdom, like, what advice would you give to someone that might be unsure if they have ADHD, but they want to learn more about it? Like, how can they go about researching this?
Um, well, honestly, like my immediate advice would be like pause this podcast, set a 25-minute timer right now,
Right.
and spend the next 25 minutes looking for a psychiatrist that you can access, right? Assuming you can, because that is a privilege,
Right.
that are either in your area or remote, and book an appointment. Like that would be my immediate next step advice to somebody, because if they're listening to this, chances are they might already, this might be a part of their research, right?
Right.
Um, so I would say do that first, because even if you end up going and they say, no, that's not it, you're one step closer to figuring out what is going on.
Hmm.
Um, Whereas I know for me, like I can fall into like research holes, and it ends up being like a way for me to avoid or procrastinate, like taking action.
Right.
Um, and I would also say that if me telling you that and you hearing that advice puts like a shiver down your spine, then definitely pause this podcast, set a 25-minute timer, look up psychiatrist, and book an appointment ASAP, because that is a very challenging thing to do for somebody with ADHD. It sounds simple, but it requires a lot of executive functioning and a lot of scary kind of things, you know? So
Yeah.
depending on how you reacted to that might also give you a clue.
Yeah, and I think that's really sound advice because with social media, especially TikTok, it is great to start learning about things, but there is a lot of, I'll say, false diagnosing that takes place, right?
Yeah.
It's just the nature with healing content in general. There's a lot of people misdiagnosing themselves sometimes, but then there are a lot of people who are like having those aha moments where the light bulb goes off and they're like, oh shit, this is me. Like, this explains everything. And I think that's still valuable, but it's also important to like really lean on the professionals who can give you that outside perspective sometimes. But it's also important to shop around as well, right? Like,
Oh, absolutely.
really
Yeah.
find someone that you vibe with and that you respect and resonate with, because sometimes getting a misdiagnosis is still a reality in today's world. Even though we have
Oh, yeah.
much more access to knowledge, it still happens, right? And so,
And that's like even more why I would suggest, and my like natural response to most things is not go see a doctor. You know, like I have trust issues with doctors.
yeah,
For ADHD specifically, like maybe it's like no harm, no foul if you think you have it, and self-diagnosis is completely valid. However, treatment is behind the professionals.
right.
Like the best treatment. So that is why that would be like my first suggestion for people. But yeah, I mean, that's another reason why I say go for it now, because sadly, you might be starting a 2-3 year journey of getting misdiagnosed. And, you know, like me being on bipolar meds when you don't need them, or,
Yeah.
you know, just wasting time essentially. So, not to say that like I tried to make the first advice like really simple, and then I also made it extremely overwhelming. You know, like this is going to take forever and it's never going to work. So forget that last part.
Yeah. Well, I think that's fair too, because like, you know, you've spent a lifetime, assuming however long someone's been alive for, with this, possibly.
Yeah.
And it's going to take some time to really unpack it and figure out how to manage it effectively. And I think you shared some little golden nuggets there that could be easily missed, you know, like setting a timer, you know, even for just like daily functions. I'm wondering if there's certain ways in your personal life where now that you've learned more about ADHD, you've kind of changed, like setting timers for things, for like doing chores or doing certain tasks. Like, what does the day in the life of Allie look like in terms of executive function? I'm curious about that.
This healing podcast is about to become a horror podcast really quickly, Charlie.
Yeah. Time to change genres.
Yeah. That would actually be kind of cool. But scary. Okay.
Yeah.
So I would say like there is less in my life in like a daily, weekly, monthly, however much time way that my ADHD like does not affect, then there, am I saying that right? It affects basically everything is what I'm saying. So like it comes down to sleep. Like people with ADHD have like a different, what's that clock that you have in your body?
Oh, I think it's the circadian rhythm, maybe?
Yes. We have like a later circadian rhythm that is like 2 hours after non-ADHD people. So we're already having like sleep issues. So like that right there is something that I've had to learn to manage. So I have to take melatonin. I'm on prescription sleep pills, and I have to like create an environment that is very conducive to sleeping, because when you don't get enough sleep, and this is probably like the basics for most people, but even without ADHD, you're functioning less well the next day, you know? So not having a good night's sleep is like you have ADHD, but then your ADHD has ADHD. So if you can think of any element really, it affects it. And like with the timer thing, the reason that I suggested that is because I've learned that I can trick my brain into doing something and focusing on something if I know that it's going to end. And that I have a specific time for it to stop, because I can say to myself, I only need to do this for 25 minutes. I only need to do this for 25 minutes. And like using that strategy for essentially anything that I'm kind of like avoiding, like chores or work, or even stuff I really love doing, like editing my videos and making content.
Yeah.
I've learned to use that kind of method, 25 minutes on, a 5-minute break, or some iteration of that. And that was like one of the things that actually helped my platform blow up in the first place, because I started doing live streams for people with ADHD, and we were using that same time blocking method. So yeah, I would highly suggest, if you have ADHD or you think you might, experimenting with that, doing the timer. It's called the Pomodoro method. If anybody wants to look into it.
Yeah, I remember hearing about that and learning about it when I was actually working more in tech, with like time blocking and that sort of thing. Because like you have like a huge workload, it's just like impossible to get everything done to the highest degree, and so you really have to make decisions on the fly. And that method was actually really monumental for me. And maybe I was indirectly managing my ADHD that I didn't know I had. So that's great advice. I like that, because it's something that people can start implementing today, right? Yep. It is not something that they need to go and seek help for. They need to invest money and time into. It's just a Google search away, which I think is monumental. And honestly, why I started, my TikTok page and this podcast, because I want to give people something that they can walk away with, that they can think about and be like, you know what, I can start doing that now. And one of the other interesting things.
That's very noble of you.
Yeah, thank you. And it's also why I look for guests like yourself who don't necessarily monetize every aspect of their platform. They just want to create community, which is amazing. And I like the one part about how you mentioned, you would do little things to trick your brain. Of course, there's a lot of great ways where we can, trick our psychology to get more things done. But there's other areas in life where you can't really trick your brain. And one of those areas is dating. And I'm kind of curious, you kind of talked about this in your content as well. How has ADHD impacted your dating life? And feel free to go into as much or as little detail as you'd like. Anything you feel comfortable sharing, by all means, please do.
I would say that similar to, the question of like, how does ADHD affect your personal life? How does it affect your career? How does it affect your sleep schedule? Is similar to how does it affect your dating? The only worst part about it is that now other people are involved,
Yeah.
that you're trying to build, ideally like a strong relationship with. It makes dating really challenging. I've noticed that I do tend to attract partners who kind of perpetuate that like reward cycle, that's so kind of like built in with ADHD and dopamine seeking. People who are unpredictable, or unreliable or emotionally unavailable.
Mm-hmm.
And, for some reason, like even before we started recording, when you asked me like, oh, how are you doing? And I was just like, well, I'm in a moment of chaos, but I feel at my best. Like that's kind of what it is.
Yeah.
It's like, as long as there's some sort of chaos about this person or this situation, the chances are I'm going to pursue it. And that is something I am still working on very, very much, because it is a hell of a beast.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And that's incredibly honest too. And I think to a degree, because we'll definitely get into this in a minute, but like you also having fearful avoidant attachment or disorganized attachment, there's a lot of misconceptions about that attachment style. And people will assume that like, people who have that attachment style, they lack self-awareness. They are,
I wish
very aloof.
I lacked self-awareness.
Yeah.
That'd be amazing.
Exactly. It's almost like that Nirvana song where it's like, I want to be dumb because life is easier, right? But we are often very self-aware people, and that almost makes life somewhat harder. And I think it's good that you have that self-awareness, because it shows that like this has been an evolving process for you. It's something that you recognize the progress you've already made, but there's still some work that needs to be done, which is arguably a good place to be in dating, because, when you start dating someone else, you can say, hey, this is where I'm at, right? You can be honest about that rather than not having the awareness at all, right? So I'd say that's a really good thing. Do you have any tips for people with ADHD who are having struggles with dating?
Yeah, I would say if you feel comfortable disclosing, kind of like what you just said, like, bringing that up at the top when you first meet them, if you feel comfortable disclosing with a potential partner that you do have ADHD, or you suspect that you do, and this is the way that I struggle with it, and this is how it might manifest in a romantic relationship, I think giving another person that heads up not only helps them to not, assume something that isn't true, like, oh, they're not getting back to me because they're not interested, whereas it might just be the ADHD person feels overwhelmed by their phone and can't look at it. You know what I mean? But it also helps the person with ADHD, because at least for me, it kind of feels like this, I already gave you a disclaimer type of feeling. Like not like you knew what you were getting into, but like, I know my struggles, I know my challenges, and I know how they can sometimes negatively affect other people. I'm aware of them, I'm working on them, and I feel better knowing that I've communicated that to somebody first, instead of leading them into a situation where they might be dating me and being like, the fuck is this girl's problem? You know what I mean? So it gives you a little relief, and it could, lower the chances of issues in the future if this person does stick around or you decide to keep them around.
Yeah, I think that's really good because, really front loading, not necessarily like getting all your baggage or your dirty laundry out, but just
Yeah.
saying like, hey, I have this thing that I'm working on. And then when it actually happens, relating that again to being like, hey, yeah, remember that thing I told you about? That's what this is, right? To
Yes.
really paint it clearly for people so that they don't have a misconception about what it is until they actually see it. And nobody's going to really know how impactful it is until they experience it with you.
Hmm.
But I think what really helps a lot of people is just at the core of it, like that communication again about it. Really just saying, hey, yeah, we spoke about this. This is what it is. This is what I could really use from you right now. This is what I could really benefit from, and how you could really help me in that situation. Thinking back on maybe past relationships where ADHD was a real challenge for you. What helped you in those relationships? Like, what was it about your partner that made managing ADHD a little bit better? Like, what sort of things could they provide for you or bring to the relationship that made it less impactful?
I will get to that in just a moment, but I do want to clarify also that my last response was not like a get out of jail free card to use ADHD as an excuse for bad behavior. That's
Totally.
probably without saying, but it is not okay for you to be like, hey, I treated you like shit, but I got ADHD, so sorry. Like, that is
Yeah.
not what I was trying to, that's not the message I was trying to communicate. So I just want to be super clear that it's about connecting and communicating with somebody and still doing like actively harm, like reducing harm that you would
Right.
cause to another person.
Yeah.
But things that have really helped me in past relationships, I would say compassion is a huge one because I was not lucky enough to have that in every relationship I was in. But some of them, with the ones that were that was huge. Like, just not judging me or like further shaming me, which I already have enough going on in my head for not doing a chore when I said I was going to do it, or getting too overwhelmed to like make plans with friends or anything, any other example you can come up with, not making me feel worse about that, was big, and ironically, or maybe not so ironically, at least at the beginning, one of my healthiest relationships were with somebody who is neurotypical, and who had a secure attachment style. So I find that very interesting for a lot of reasons. And that's actually the only securely attached person I ever dated. And that relationship was so much different than every other one. So yeah, just being compassionate, being understanding, assuming either positive or neutral intent, not assuming negative intent. Like, because I didn't answer you does not mean I'm cheating on you. It means I'm probably playing video games, like that
Yeah.
kind of thing. But it's also kind of just like the golden rule, just treat the person in your life with ADHD the way that you would want to be treated, but except if your brain was broken.
Yeah.
Like, there's it. Yeah.
That's a really honest way to put it. I like that.
Yeah.
Which kind of leads me to like the next topic, which is um, kind of one of my favorites. Is it's the intersection between ADHD and attachment styles, and in your case, disorganized attachment. Now, based on my research, I've kind of learned that for some people, ADHD it's almost cyclical, where there are times in their life where it's really present, almost like the seasons, and then it kind of tapers down a bit. It kind of calms down. And the same can also be applied to attachment styles, right?
Hmm.
You
Yeah.
depending on the situation or the person or the environment, you could be leaning more secure or, high functioning. And if you're in a certain situation, suddenly like it just kicks into overdrive, just there to
Yeah.
protect you. So I'm kind of curious, like, have you noticed any correlations between ADHD and your attachment style, depending on the types of relationships you've had?
Yeah. I mean, I haven't had the language until very recently to see that there was like a link between these two things. But on a gut level, I've always felt like they were connected in some way. And it wasn't until maybe like last year, or even earlier this year, that I started reading Dr. Gabor Mate's.
Gabor Mate, yeah, I like him.
Yeah, he's great. His book Scattered Minds, which is, he has ADHD.
Yeah.
His children have ADHD. Where I realized that there actually is like a theory and that he's positing in the book that like ADHD in itself is an attachment wound.
Mm-hmm.
So between that and that like fearful avoidant specifically, one of like the markers is having a kind of traumatic upbringing, having a tumultuous childhood. It's kind of one of the markers for ADHD too. So it's just interesting to see that, like, is it the chicken or the egg kind of thing? Or is it like the chicken? It's the chicken with the egg for me, you know, like it's the chicken and the
both.
egg. They're just like, yeah. So I wonder, I think like what I would really like to look into more, and this is probably my next step in like my own like therapeutic kind of realm, is trauma. Like I do think predominantly both can come down to some level of trauma that hasn't maybe been processed or properly healed or just addressed. So yeah, I would also like highly recommend that book. It's a little outdated because he wrote it a while ago, but it is the first time that I've seen somebody that has like professional acumen, like he's an actual doctor, and ADHD, because so many of the people who are like sharing about ADHD and giving their like expert takes don't have it. So like seeing somebody who has like the lived experience and the academic and professional career to back it up is like very enlightening. And I did not expect it to touch on that stuff at all. Like I thought it was just going to be like about ADHD. When they started getting into like attachment stuff, I was like, hold up. Okay, this makes a lot of sense now, you know? And anecdotally, like I feel like a lot of my followers who have ADHD or suspect they have ADHD identify as disorganized or fearful avoidant. A lot of my friends have both. So I definitely think there's a correlation there. I think more research needs to be done. And they show up a lot in the same, they manifest in the same way.
Yeah.
For me, at least.
Yeah, I totally agree. Like a lot of the fearful people in my life fall on the spectrum in some way, whether it's autism, ADHD, Asperger's, they're all somewhere in that spectrum. And even the same for myself, I tend to think I'm a very high functioning person. I can mask really well, but I have those moments where it's like I procrastinate like no tomorrow, right? And I have those moments where it's like I'm super productive, but also I kind of kick back and I don't do anything. I'm really unproductive. And part of it is like just life, but then the other part is like I realized it's also partly related to attachment and ADHD burnout, which is a really big thing that not a lot of people consider, right? It's also what makes, you know, managing or holding down a job much harder too, because a job by nature is like clock in, clock out 5 days a week in best case scenarios, and then do it all over again the next week, right?
Right.
That can be really exhausting because for people like us, we like to see that there's an end in sight, right? And to a career like that, the end is what you make it. There is no end. And if you feel like you're not making any progress, that's where the burnout can really start to creep up.
And I want to like interject real quick too, because I forgot to mention this earlier when you said like, what have you done to like shift your aspects of your life to kind of like help your ADHD or be more at least helpful for it. Like I burned out of working corporate, doing a 9 to 5, like after I think maybe 2 or 3 years, like it was bad. Like I got sent to rehab bad. Like it was a lot, you know? So I it took me about like a decade, I would say, maybe even a little longer to like get to a point where I no longer, first of all, have a boss, and second of all, have that type of job. Like I solely do freelance and contract work now,
Yeah.
and I work from home exclusively. So like that, I didn't do any of this for any other reason aside from the fact that my ADHD can't handle the alternative. That's it. Like I had to do this because I can't live without making money, but I knew that I was like on a fast track to just like burning out again and I don't know, possibly ending up in rehab again if I just went back to that environment, you know? So, right, like what works best for me, I'm not reaching my highest like earning potential or whatever, but having part-time work that is remote and being able to spend as much time as I can and have the option to on like my passion projects, my hobbies, or just recovering, you know, from
Yeah.
the overwhelm, like literally resting, like having more time to rest is huge. So yeah, that's definitely a major thing, a major struggle for people with ADHD and anybody like, you know, neurodivergent. But I try to advocate for work environments that are more accessible to people with ADHD. And like even in the small communications firm that I'm contracted with, I've been very, very vocal about my ADHD. It was actually something I said during our first interview before I got hired, you know. And now they kind of, you know, it's a small team, but they let me come in and do like presentations on how to best manage it. And I bring it up very freely. And that's like a very relieving thing that I know so many people don't get the luxury
Yeah.
of. But if there's even like small ways that you can kind of try and move that needle forward to make it a more accessible place for you or other ADHD people down the line, I would definitely say do that.
Yeah, no, that's great. And like, I'm happy that you've been able to kind of create that type of a work environment with your employer, because you are right. Like, a lot of people don't get access to that. And, you know, when you consider that the company has its own objectives, they don't necessarily place the well-being and the happiness of the employees that high
Yeah.
up on the corporate goals, right? And so thinking back on like one of my first tech jobs was in office 5 days a week and doing calls, answering emails. Like I felt overstimulated every single day that I was there, and I only lasted maybe 8 months. That was the shortest
Yeah.
job I've ever
That's a
had.
while.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I noticed it was kind of similar to when I was more deeply unhealed, to my relationships, where it's like, okay, around the 6 to 8 month
Mm,
mark, I'm getting burnt out, I'm getting tired, I'm losing inspiration, and I want to go and find something else. And there's a
that's a
lot
great
of
connection.
there's a lot of people who date fearful avoidance who can attest to around the 7 month mark. It's called the 7 month itch, that they
Yeah.
just suddenly pull away. And I think, you know, part of that is like, mainly speaking for a disorganized attachment here, is like in the pursuit of seeking connection and being so drawn into
Mm,
someone, we are willing to forego some of our more basic needs. And
yeah.
in the pursuit of seeking approval and gaining approval, um, we will ignore some of what our body is telling us, like rest, you know, relax. And we're willing to kind of, you know, text every day, see this other person every single day. And that leads to burnout in relationships too, right? And
Yep.
I think ADHD definitely plays a role in that as well, because part of ADHD is like looking for that dopamine rush in itself
Hmm.
from completing tasks or getting something done. And the same can be said in relationships, right? You feel like
Yeah.
you're getting validation, you're being seen, and you're getting connection. And then it kind of hits you and you're like, whoa, but I'm not getting everything
Whoa,
else
I'm
in my
being
life.
seen, I'm getting connection.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then
Ugh,
you kind of step back. And
don't do
so,
that.
yeah. Which I kind of want you to elaborate a little bit as well, is like ADHD as an attachment wound, but not necessarily a disorder. Um, how do you see like that? now versus how you did in the past? Because like that must have been like a revelation for you, right? Like how has your
Absolutely, yeah.
perception of ADHD changed since then?
I think more so my perception of my attachment style changed, because it was kind of, well, I suppose it's both. Um, but yeah, like realizing that was kind of just like, again, it was so much a feeling of resentment, but it was a little bit defeating, right? Like it's a revelatory moment, and I'm like, holy crap, this makes so much sense. These things are linked up together, but like it's also kind of scary to be like, I have so much working against me now. You know what I mean? Like I thought it was just ADHD over here, just fearful avoidant attachment style over here, but now it's like they're both kind of contributing to these, destructive or like harmful behaviors that I don't want to really display anymore, that I really want to shift or heal. Um, what was the question?
It was, I guess it was kind of like an open question. Like, how has your
Oh, like how has
perspective
it changed?
shifted? Yeah.
Yes, yes. So it's just kind of given me a deeper understanding. It's made me a little bit more, not hopeless, but like a little bit more, you know, I realize that it's a little bit more challenging and intertwined than I originally expected. So it's going to take a little bit more work, you
Right.
know?
Right.
It's not a death sentence. It's not like a doom moment, you know?
Yeah, and I think that's an important thing to share too, because like a lot of people, and I think there's a lot of stigma that people with ADHD face, but also when you talk about avoidant and fearful avoidant attachment in particular, given that there's a lot of social stigma attached to those labels, when people discover these things, they often catastrophize it, right? They make it seem worse than it actually is. Mainly because they see all these people talking poorly about these people, and they've seen nothing but the consequences of what that life has been like when it's been unmanaged. But it's really important to kind of bring it down to earth a little bit, right? It's not a
Yeah,
death sentence, and it might not necessarily be as bad as you might think, because in some ways it's actually helped you to cope, soothe, and survive, right? And
right.
I think in some ways, like ADHD has kind of helped you, right? There's probably some
Yeah.
situations where it kind of was your
I
kind
wouldn't
of.
trade it for the world. I wouldn't. And like some people will go against that or be like, that's a bad take, but like I wouldn't, you know?
Yeah, I think that's just by definition who you are, right? Like it's what helps you see the world in the way that you do. And a lot of creative people have
Mm-hmm.
ADHD, right? I think there might be something else to that too. People who are like out of the box thinkers and can really deconstruct the world around them in ways that most people can't perceive. It could be related to whether it was trauma they experienced early in life, where they have some undiagnosed personality trait that really shapes how they interact with their world. And I think whether it's your attachment style, ADHD, or autism, or anything else, it is really about finding the ways that it works for you and also works
Mm-hmm.
against you, right? Because not everything needs to be fixed or healed, right?
Absolutely. That's
Yeah.
big.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
I'm curious, maybe you could elaborate on that, like some of the things in your life with ADHD that you just accept and you're like, no, no, I'm happy with that part. Like, it's more these areas over here that I need to kind of manage more. Like, have you had any areas like that where you're like happy with those traits?
Yeah. There are definitely a few things, and I don't know that I can attribute them to ADHD, but again, I've met people who have kind of had similar experiences. But like in general, my tendency to question tradition for tradition's sake, to question why something is done the way that it is, and then pushing back if the answer is because that's the way it's always been done. Kind of like shifting, like being very comfortable outside of the box, I think is something I'm really proud of for myself, like, and I don't know that that would be as prominent in my personality, if not for the ADHD or whatever it might be. That and just like, I'm endlessly curious. I have like a thirst for like learning and discovering and finding out things that like is unmatched. So like I love that about myself. I love that I'm like curious and open-minded and not willing to just be in an environment because that's what I'm told that's the one that I'm supposed to be in, or do things a certain way because that's the way that it's supposed to be done. So there are definitely some good things for sure.
Yeah,
It is debilitating, but there are some good things. So that's nice.
Yeah, I like that because it's a really good perspective about your life where it's like, yeah, not everything is doom and gloom. There's a lot of great things, but also through the natural course of you as a person, it helps you navigate life in ways that most people don't. And I think we need people who lead with curiosity by nature to really push society further, right? To redefine what life could be rather than as it has always been, right? And
Yeah.
I think that's a really nice way to put it. And so the last thing I wanted to ask you before we wrap things up is, what would you say to someone to help them view ADHD and attachment wounds with a little bit more empathy, right? Because these things in life, they're often viewed with a lot of vitriol and a lot of frustration from the people who have either dated someone with ADHD or insecure attachment. And so I'm curious, even if it's just a simple thing to help create more empathy, what would you share with someone to help them start viewing it with a little bit more humanity?
Personally, I struggle a bit with empathy. But something that has stuck with me that I learned in like a 12-step program years and years and years ago. This is going to be like the opposite of empathy. I'm so sorry. But like, it's this saying that's like, other people's opinions of me are not my business. Like, I have to be good with me. Like, I have to be good with me. And like, if you can take what other people are saying about like your attachment style or your ADHD or whatever else it might be, and like remove how they view you and instead like view yourself in your own light, I think that kind of leads the way to empathy. But yeah, I mean, just like empathy's tough just because like I feel like a lot of people that are neurodivergent tend to like struggle with it. Like I usually engage in cognitive empathy,
Right.
which is like, oh, I realize that's something that in this situation, what is called for is to like put my hand on this person's shoulder. But maybe like focusing more on the perhaps fewer like good things about that, like fearful avoidant kind of sucks, but I've also like pulled a lot of girls, so I'm doing something right. You know what I mean? Like there's good parts about it. And maybe if we just not to, be all love and light and spiritually bypass or anything, but every once in a while focus on the more positive aspects of who we are, we can, love ourselves a little bit more and then make way for other people to love us as a result.
Yeah, I really like that because people with ADHD and insecure attachment, they often really struggle with self-esteem and they have a low definition of their own self-worth. And
yeah,
I think you are right. The path to creating empathy from others is to first give yourself a little bit more empathy and just accept who you are and focus on the good and the bad rather than letting the bad overshadow the good, right? Because by nature, you're going to naturally stand up for yourself in a way that is honest and true to those traits, and other people will start to see that, right? You'll just naturally carry yourself in that way. And so I think that's a really good way to put it.
You tied what I said together very nicely and gracefully, so thank you for that.
Yeah, as I said, I'm really high functioning, so I know how to spin things. Maybe I should come and work with you in PR, and we can make a killer duo.
You're natural. Yeah.
Well, that's awesome. Well, Allie, thank you so much for joining the show. Like, as I said, your content is really insightful, and having you on the show today has been insightful and inspiring. For the viewers and listeners, please share what you currently have going on in your life and how people can connect with you on social media to follow you further.
As you know, because I've been talking about my unpublished YouTube video since as long as we started talking about this podcast, my main focus right now is breathing life back into my YouTube channel. I've taken an unintended, overextended break from it. But I am going to be uploading a video soon that specifically deals with the challenges that people with ADHD face when they're in the dating world. Because I posted an ADHD dating tips video probably like 2 years ago. It did really well and it was really successful, at least for my channel standards on YouTube. But a lot of people had, some feedback that was like, this seems like it's all geared towards the neurotypical person dating the person with ADHD. And I was like, you know what? You're right. Which is crazy because like I came up with these tips with a group of ADHD people, yet we all still ended up gearing it towards the neurotypical. So now this new video is going to be geared towards the person with ADHD. Like, what can you do when you come up against these common challenges? Because it's not the same as being in a romantic relationship, right. Dating, it's totally different. So I definitely think attachment style came up naturally while I was filming. So I think that's going to lead the way for a lot more conversations and content around the intersection of those two things, which is part of the reason I'm super grateful to be a guest on your podcast, because it kind of helped reignite that passion about these things for me as well. And yeah, so I'm Allie K. Campbell on everything. Well, not everything, but like YouTube, Instagram, TikTok, and definitely click the notification thing on YouTube so you get notified when I do upload the video. I'm hoping that this will act as motivation for me to get going on the editing. I have one final edit and I've just been like procrastinating it, but I'll get there.
That's the nature of the game, right? I totally understand that. You can edit to the end of the earth and still feel like, oh, I there's like 5%. I can just make it a little bit better.
Right.
So I totally get that. Well, I'll make sure to link to your social media in the descriptions of where this is posted. But thank you so much for joining, and to the viewers and listeners, thank you so much for tuning in. I hope you gained value and insight from our conversation today. As promised, I will include Allie's links in the description if you're interested in following her journey. Until next time, see you in the next episode, and happy healing.